Joined now by Congressman Mike Gallagher, our Patriot Mobile Member of the Week, of course, representing Wisconsin. He also, very few people know this, he won his high school disco contest, and he did it to that song, and I always like to tell people about that. Congressman Gallagher, good morning. It's great to have you on. I have two things to talk to you about, the F-35 purchase and the National Defense Authorization Act out of the House. Where would you like to start?
Well, first of all, Hugh, how did you know that about me in high school? That is some deep research. You know, I'm a huge disco fan, and that is my jam that you played.
That is. I got it out of the yearbook. I'm collecting yearbooks on everyone after the Brett Kavanaugh affair. Everybody's yearbook is fair game. So let's start with the NDAA, actually, because it came out of the House. I think $733 billion is the top line. Disappointing. A lot of disappointing restrictions in it. It's got to go to the Senate, which will come out at $750 or more. But tell me what your reaction to the NDAA is.
Well, I'm very concerned, Hugh. For the last 30 years in the Armed Services Committee, we have passed an overwhelmingly bipartisan bill. For example, the vote last year was 60-1, I believe. And it is the rare bright spot in an otherwise dark and dysfunctional Congress. And so if the bill that we emerge with after an all-day, all-night markup that we're going to be starting at about 9:45 Eastern Time today is loaded down with partisan provisions, and we're hearing talk of abortion provisions, a proactive restriction on using military force for Iran and Venezuela, blocking arms sales to Saudi and UAE, and, of course, the overall disappointing top-line number. If that's the final product we emerge with, I fear we are going to, for the first time in 30 years, have a purely partisan party line vote. And I think that's bad for the military. I think it reduces our ability to negotiate with the Senate in conference. And I think it increases the likelihood that we will have another budget crisis at the end of September, and the military will be forced to operate under yet another continuing resolution, as it has for 1,000 days over the past 10 years. Now, I'm going to go in there with a positive mindset. I'm going to try to proactively engage with my Democratic colleagues, offer reasonable compromises. I know Mac Thornberry, the ranking member, wants to do the same. So I'm not giving up yet, but I really hope my Democratic colleagues don't use this as a partisan exercise, because we'd be doing the military a disservice.
Well, that's where I come down, Congressman. There are lots of fronts on which the abortion battle can be waged, mostly in the courts. There are lots of places you can debate the Guantanamo Bay facility and who is coming and who is going. There are lots of places to do this, but this is at bottom line about keeping our troops safe by keeping them ready and supplied. And I'd always thought that the Armed Services Committee was sort of where the sane Democrats went to legislate.
Exactly. I mean, we have some great Democrats on the committee, particularly the newer members. This will be really interesting, Hugh. I forget the exact number, but there's something like 5 or more new Democratic members of the committee who are in districts that Trump won and won their election by less than 1%. And so I suspect they're going to be uncomfortable with the direction this thing is going. And we have some Democrats with great foreign policy background, whether it's Elaine Luria, who spent a career in the Navy, or Jason Crow, who just jumped out of an airplane, a perfectly good airplane he jumped out of in Normandy because of his military background. A lot of really smart folks that I think came to the committee wanting to put the country and the military ahead of partisan politics. So I really hope we do not go down this road. And I look forward to this all-day, all-night markup every year. This is the most fun I have in Congress. And it is the rare example of a committee that actually does its work, that actually authorizes on time. And I really don't want to screw that up.
I don't know whether law geeks or defense geeks are worse, but you just gained a good argument for defense geeks being worse than law geeks. All right, let's go to the F-35. Yesterday, it was announced that the Pentagon and Lockheed have agreed to buy 470 new F-35 fighter jets. Let me tell you, they're popping the champagne in Fort Worth, but not just in Fort Worth. If you look, for example, in Pennsylvania, $400 million impact, 3,370 jobs. If you look in Michigan, a $500 million, $500 million impact, 5,780 jobs. This is a big deal, but in Texas, it's almost a $10 billion deal with 52,000 jobs. And mostly, we need these F-35s, and we need them to work. What do you think?
Well, I was just in Fort Worth, Cowtown, as they call it, and it is booming. My gosh. And so it's a good thing, obviously, for Texas, for the defense industrial base. However, there was a report this morning from Defense News that further illustrated some of the problems the F-35 is having. For example, it seems to go into stall or flutter if you go up by 20 degrees, meaning it will be very difficult to maneuver if it gets into a dogfight. Now, this aircraft was not necessarily designed to be a true dogfighter. It's instead a beyond visual range aircraft with missiles that are intended to engage its enemies at great distances. But this is a problem. There are other problems that are suggested in the report, such as if it goes into sustained afterburner and advances to Mach 1.2, the airframe and tail surfaces begin to melt. That's a significant issue. And on the missiles engaging at great range, there's a question as to whether we have missiles that will be able to engage our adversary's stealth aircraft. So that's why the aircraft, for example, asked for their variant, the F-35A, to have a nose gun. So the problems we are seeing with this aircraft are legitimately a big deal, and we should not seek to downplay them, particularly since we're spending $100 million per airframe for a fighter that potentially can't fight. But that doesn't mean we abandon it entirely. We need to work through these issues. We need to get a workable aircraft to the fleet, because it's not just our own military that needs it. It's all our allies around the world that are buying this from us. And I fear that market could dry up if we see more and more problems leak out to the press. For example, we had a Japanese pilot that we lost who was flying an F-35. Apparently was a very senior pilot, but due to problems with the aircraft, crashed.
Can you tell me a little bit about whether or not the NDAA and the House continues the acquisition of F-18s as the transition of the fleet to the F-35 is going to be longer than anticipated?
I'd have to check with my colleagues that are on that committee. I will tell you, however, that subcommittee. I will tell you, however, just on the issue of the F-35, one significant thing we are doing in the NDAA is limiting the transfer of any F-35 aircraft or related materials to Turkey, unless the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State jointly certify that Turkey has provided credible assurances it will not accept delivery of the S-400 air defense system. This is a Russian missile air defense system, and we are rightly concerned that plugging that system into Turkey's defense network could compromise our F-35 system if it's operating on the same network. So that's perhaps the most significant F-35 related proposal that's contained within the NDAA, and I would say it's a bipartisan proposal. And there's a lot of great bipartisan stuff in there. And again, back to our first subject of discussion, I don't want some of the more partisan political posturing to get in the way of the really great work we've done over the past year on the Armed Services Committee.
Now, Congressman Gallagher, this is a sensitive subject. It's personnel. I believe in innocence until proven guilty, but there have been some shakeups in the Navy. I believe the Naval War College. There's a question of whether or not Acting Defense Secretary Shanahan is going to actually get the nomination. There are rumors swirling around the Secretary of the Navy and whether or not the president's dissatisfied with him. What is your fix on the president's view on our leadership in the Defense Department and the service branches?
Well, it's a huge problem, Hugh. There's a lot of positions below the secretary level, both SecNav and SecDef, that remain unfilled. And I fear, I can't prove this, so this is just a sort of hunch I have. I fear there are some in the White House who think that by not appointing some of these positions, they are somehow draining the swamp, when the opposite is true. If you don't get your political appointees in there, advancing your priorities, your agenda, then the bureaucracy is going to do its thing. Inertia is going to win out, and we're never going to get change. I mean, the Pentagon is a massive bureaucracy, and it requires leadership from the presidential level on down in order to shift it in a different direction. And at a time when we are trying to effectuate perhaps the most important shift of my lifetime in defense and national security policy, which is to say the shift away from prioritizing counterterrorism operations to prioritizing great power competition, the president needs people in all these key positions. And so there is never a perfect person for the job, but you have to find the best player available and put them on the field. And right now we have too many players sitting on the sidelines that aren't doing their job We want this to be the Green Bay Packers, not the Cleveland Browns.
Now, I think you're going to switch that analogy in about 3 months. But let me quickly get to the question of China. As we speak, Hong Kong is firing tear gas and rubber bullets at thousands of demonstrators. Also, as we speak, the Code Conference is underway saying, screw you, Washington, we don't care how big we are and you can't touch us. And at the same time, Huawei is being defended by some group here in town as not being a threat to America. All of this stuff comes together, but primarily social media seems to me to be a Trojan horse that that our competitors like China are infiltrating.
It's possible, Hugh. I mean, quickly on Hong Kong, which I salute you for covering because I fear it hasn't gotten enough coverage. This is a huge development. The last time Hong Kong saw a major strike action was during the Cultural Revolution leftist riots of 1967. I think this demonstrates the continued erosion of the one country, two systems framework. It puts Hong Kong's special status in international affairs at risk, and it also shows the dangers of allowing the Chinese Communist Party to have further control. The CCP loves to talk about one country, two systems, but the reality is they have been making Hong Kong less free, like the mainland, step by step since they took over. And this extradition treaty that millions have taken to the streets to protest would be the final blow to even marginal freedom in Hong Kong. I think it could also violate provisions of the U.S. Hong Kong Policy Act. So this is a huge development, and it just further illustrates something that we've talked about multiple times on your show, Hugh, that really the two systems at play here, our system, the U.S.-led system, and the dystopian future offered by the Chinese Communist Party are incompatible. And engaging in this competition, preparing for winning this competition is the foremost task facing our national security.
Very quickly, Congressman, you know what happens in China? They get very worried about a fever spreading. And if Hong Kong isn't put down, they will be afraid it'll be Shanghai, and after Shanghai, Beijing, and after Beijing, the outlying precincts. Do you expect them to turn to Tiananmen Square-style violence if necessary?
I think they will attempt with every means available to tamp down the protests, but perhaps in a more subtle way than Tiananmen. And I fear we're going to see more subtle and sophisticated means of undermining democracy in places like Taiwan, which, of course, China wants to unify with the mainland. General Secretary Xi has repeatedly said as much, and has said they will do it with force if necessary. They have always maintained the option of using force, but I think they can effectuate it through more subtle means, whether it's cyber means or buying off people within the political system there. And so that's why what's happening in Hong Kong is so important, because it is a harbinger of future Chinese Communist Party behavior.
Mike Gallagher, always a pleasure to talk to you. Disco Mike Gallagher, always a pleasure from Wisconsin. Come back next week.